The October wind carried the scent of frost across the Montana plains, cutting through the gaps in the barn walls with a low whistle that sounded almost alive. James Crawford had learned to distinguish every creak and groan of the old structure over the past 3 years, each sound cataloged in the back of his mind like entries in a ledger he never asked to keep. The rotting beam near the hayloft, the loose shutter on the north wall, the way the floorboards settled when the temperature dropped below freezing. But this sound was different. It started on a Tuesday 3 nights ago, just after midnight, when the ranch fell into that particular stillness that comes only to places where human voices have gone silent for too long. A low, mournful howl that seemed to rise from beneath the earth itself, resonating through the barn's foundation with enough force to rattle the tools hanging on the far wall. James had been up late as usual, sitting on the porch with a beer he wouldn't finish and a book he wouldn't read when the sound cut through the darkness like a blade. Coyotes, he told himself, or the wind playing tricks through the coulees that scarred the landscape beyond his property line. The second night, the howl came earlier, just after sunset, and lasted longer. There was something almost conversational about it, a cadence that suggested intelligence rather than simple animal distress. James had walked out to the barn with his flashlight boots crunching through the first dusting of snow and stood in the doorway scanning the shadows. Nothing moved. The cattle in the far pasture were calm, undisturbed by whatever had made the sound. On the third night, he heard it while working late in the barn itself, reorganizing the feed storage that had fallen into chaos over the months since he'd stopped caring about such things. The howl rose from directly beneath his feet, so close and so clear that he dropped the 50-pound sack of grain he'd been carrying. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, and in the silence that followed, he heard something else breathing. Deep, labored, unmistakably alive. Now on the fourth night, James knelt on the barn floor, with his ear pressed against the thick oak planks his great-great-grandfather had laid in 1875. The wood should have been solid, resting on packed earth and a stone foundation that had supported loaded hay wagons for nearly 150 years. But when he rapped his knuckles against the boards, they responded with a hollow echo that made his pulse quicken. The breathing came again, rhythmic and heavy, accompanied by the faint sound of movement. Something large was down there, something that shouldn't exist in the space between his barn floor and the Montana earth. James pushed himself to his feet and retrieved the crowbar from the tool rack, its weight familiar in his hands. 3 years of working this ranch alone had taught him to approach problems methodically, without the luxury of calling for help or waiting for someone else to make the hard decisions. When the well pump failed, he fixed it. When the cattle got out through a broken fence, he rounded them up. When his wife and daughter died on a highway 40 miles from home, he buried them and kept working because there was nothing else to do. The first board came up with a screech of nails pulling free from wood that had held them for longer than James had been alive. Dust and the smell of old earth rose from the gap, and with it another sound, a low whimper that carried a note of pain so acute it made him pause. Whatever was down there was suffering. The second board revealed more of the darkness below, and when James aimed his flashlight into the opening, the beam caught the edge of something, wooden steps descending into what appeared to be a carefully constructed stairway. Not a natural cavity or a collapsed section of foundation, but deliberate architecture built with the same craftsmanship that characterized everything else his great-great-grandfather Samuel had created on this land. The third board opened the space wide enough for a man to descend, and James swung his legs over the edge before his rational mind could catalog all the reasons this was a terrible idea. The steps were solid beneath his boots, worn smooth in the center as if from regular use, though he'd lived on this property his entire life and never known this entrance existed. The beam of his flashlight revealed a tunnel extending beyond the stairs, supported by thick wooden beams and lined with carefully fitted stones. The air was cool but not damp, suggesting ventilation somewhere in the system. And as he descended the last few steps, James realized he was standing in a space large enough to be called a room, rather than simply a tunnel. And in the far corner, a pair of golden eyes reflected his flashlight like twin suns. James froze his hand, tightening on the flashlight as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The wolf was massive, easily 140 pounds, with a broad head and thick gray fur that marked him as a mature male. But it was the eyes that stopped James's breath in his chest, intelligent, assessing, locked onto his face with an intensity that felt less like a wild animal's fear and more like a conscious decision being made. The wolf didn't snarl or bare its teeth. It didn't scramble backward or assume a defensive posture. Instead, it simply watched James with those remarkable golden eyes, and in that gaze, James recognized something he'd seen in his daughter Lily's face whenever she was hurt and seeking comfort, a plea for help from someone who understood that help was desperately needed. The left hind leg was swollen and weeping, the infection obvious even from 15 feet away. The wolf shifted its weight carefully, favoring the injured limb, and released another low whimper that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with pain. James had helped his wife Rachel with enough injured animals over the years to recognize when suffering outweighed caution. The wolf's breathing was labored, its coat matted with sweat despite the cool underground air, and the smell of infection hung heavy in the space between them. Every instinct built from 34 years of living in Montana cattle country screamed that this was impossible. Wild wolves avoided humans absolutely. They were ghosts in the landscape, disappearing at the first hint of human presence, their survival dependent on remaining unseen and unknown. This wolf should have been snarling, should have been desperate to escape, should have been anything other than what it was: calm, expectant, waiting for James to make the next move. James took a step forward, moving slowly, keeping his voice low and steady. The wolf's ears swiveled toward the sound, tracking his movement, but it didn't retreat. Another step, then another, until James was close enough to see the extent of the damage to the leg. The infection had spread from what looked like a puncture wound, possibly from a trap or a barbed wire fence, and without treatment, the animal would be dead within days. The chamber contained more evidence that made this encounter even stranger: food bowls recently used, and still containing dried remnants of what looked like raw meat. Water containers clean and positioned, where an animal could reach them easily. Blankets arranged in a corner, worn but cared for as if someone had been maintaining the space regularly. James's mind raced through the implications. He was the only person with access to this barn, the only one who'd inherited the property when his grandfather David had died 18 months ago. He'd been through every building, every structure, cataloging assets, and clearing out a lifetime of accumulated possessions. There had been no mention of underground chambers, no hint of secret tunnels, no explanation for the wolf now watching him with eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any wild animal should possess. The wolf made a decision. James saw it happen, saw the shift in those golden eyes from wary assessment to cautious acceptance. The animal lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and then deliberately looked from James to its injured leg and back again. It was asking for help. James Crawford had spent 3 years learning to live with the kind of loneliness that hollows a person out from the inside. After the drunk driver ran the red light after the funeral, after the last of the well-meaning neighbors stopped calling to check if he needed anything, he'd settled into a routine of simply existing. He fed the cattle, maintained the equipment, kept the ranch running because it was what his hands knew how to do. But he hadn't felt anything approaching purpose or connection since the moment he identified his wife and daughter's bodies in the county morgue. Now kneeling in an impossible chamber beneath his barn, looking into the eyes of a wolf that shouldn't trust him, shouldn't even be here. James felt something shift in his chest. The wolf needed him. For the first time in 3 years, something other than obligation was pulling him forward. The medical supplies Rachel had left behind filled an entire storage room in the barn, above antibiotics designed for livestock, bandages, syringes, disinfectant, everything a veterinarian might need for emergency treatment of large animals. James had left it all exactly as she'd organized it, unable to face the task of sorting through her professional life on top of everything else he'd lost. Now he understood why he'd kept it. Over the next 2 weeks, James fell into a pattern that gave his days structure they hadn't possessed in years. Dawn came early in late October, the sun struggling above the eastern horizon just before 7, and he'd be in the barn by 6:30 with fresh food and water. The wolf, which he'd started thinking of as Ash for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, had accepted his presence with a speed that defied everything James knew about wild animal behavior. The first few days had been purely medical: cleaning the wound, applying antibiotic ointment, changing bandages that Ash tolerated with remarkable patience. Rachel had taught him the basics of veterinary care during their years together, her gentle hands showing him how to approach injured animals, how to read their body language, how to build trust through consistent, calm interaction. But Ash demonstrated intelligence that went beyond simple tolerance of necessary treatment. When James spoke to him in the low, steady voice he'd once used to comfort Lily during thunderstorms, Ash's ears would swivel forwards, tracking the words as if parsing their meaning. When James moved the food bowls to a cleaner corner of the chamber, Ash watched the process once and then went directly to the new location on subsequent feedings. On the fifth day, James brought down one of the puzzle feeders Rachel had used to occupy bored dogs at her clinic, a simple wooden box with a sliding lid that required a specific sequence of movements to open. He filled it with strips of venison from his freezer and placed it near Ash's resting area, half expecting the wolf to ignore it or simply destroy the box to reach the food. Instead, Ash studied the mechanism for nearly a minute, his golden eyes fixed on the sliding panels before reaching out with one massive paw and manipulating the first latch. The second latch took longer, but he solved it, and when the lid finally slid open, he looked at James with an expression that seemed distinctly pleased with himself. James found himself talking to Ash during these visits, the one-sided conversations filling the underground chamber with the first human voice the space had heard since his grandfather's death. He talked about the ranch, about the challenges of running the operation alone, about the small frustrations and victories that made up his days. He talked about Rachel and Lily, their voices and faces still sharp enough in his memory to cause physical pain, and Ash would listen with his head tilted slightly, as if understanding not just the words, but the grief beneath them. On the 10th day, Ash stood and walked across the chamber without limping. The infection had cleared the wound, healing with the clean pink tissue that indicated healthy recovery, and when James examined the leg, Ash stood perfectly still, allowing the inspection without restraint or fear. That was when James discovered he wasn't alone in caring for the wolf. The automated feeding system was sophisticated, hidden in a recessed alcove that James had initially mistaken for simple storage space. Plastic containers connected to timers that would dispense food and water at regular intervals, the whole apparatus wired to a battery system designed to last for months. But the batteries were dead, the connections corroded the entire system, showing the kind of failure that comes from extended use without maintenance. Next to the system, James found his grandfather David's handwriting on a maintenance log, daily entries recording Ash's condition, food consumption, behavior patterns, extending back nearly 2 years. The final entry was dated 3 months ago, shortly before David's death, from the heart attack that had brought James back to Montana for the funeral. James, the entry read, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Ash is alone. He's not just a wolf. He's a responsibility our family has carried for generations. When the time comes, you'll understand why. Trust him, protect him, and when Sarah Mitchell finds you, listen to what she has to say." James sat in the chamber with the logbook open on his lap, trying to reconcile the grandfather he'd known with this secret keeper, this guardian of impossible things. David Crawford had been a veterinarian before age and arthritis drove him into retirement, a practical man who approached problems with methodical precision. He'd taught James to brand cattle, to read weather patterns, to maintain equipment, and manage the endless work of ranching. But he'd never mentioned underground chambers or wolves that understood human speech or family responsibilities that transcended generations. The silence in the chamber felt different, now weighted with questions James couldn't answer. How long had David been caring for Ash? Where had the wolf come from? Why had his grandfather hidden this from everyone, including his own grandson, and who was Sarah Mitchell? Ash approached slowly, his recovered leg bearing weight normally now, and rested his massive head against James's knee. The gesture was so deliberately comforting, so clearly intentional, that James felt his throat tighten. The wolf understood he was troubled, understood that the discovery of David's log had shifted something fundamental and was offering the only comfort he could provide: his presence, his trust, his acknowledgement that they were in this together. James ran his hand through Ash's thick fur, feeling the warmth of the animal's body, the steady rhythm of breathing that spoke to health and vitality. 3 weeks ago, he'd been going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. Now he woke each morning thinking about Ash, about the progress of his recovery, about the growing bond between them that defied every rational explanation. The wolf had given him purpose. More than that, he'd given him something James thought he'd lost forever, a reason to look forward rather than backward. Sarah Mitchell arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, driving a truck that had seen better decades and carrying credentials that identified her as a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. She was 37, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of weathered features that came from spending more time outdoors than in. But it was her eyes that caught James's attention, intelligent, determined, and fixed on him with an intensity that suggested this visit was anything but routine. James met her at the edge of the driveway, keeping himself positioned between her and the barn in a protective stance that felt instinctive. "Mr. Crawford, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitch. I was hoping you might grant me permission to survey your property for wolf activity." The name hit James like a physical blow. Mitchell, the same name David had written in his final log entry, the same name James had been wondering about for the past week. She showed him credentials that looked legitimate, but the timing felt calculated, deliberate, as if she'd been waiting for something before making her approach. "What kind of wolf activity?" Sarah's expression shifted slightly, and James recognized the look of someone making a decision about how much truth to reveal. "Large canine tracks, acoustic evidence of howling that doesn't match our known coyote populations. Your property borders some prime wolf habitat, Mr. Crawford. We're trying to establish whether there's a pack in the area." James felt his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 weeks of caring for Ash in secret had made him paranoid about exactly this scenario. He'd been careful, had varied his schedule, had made sure no one could track his comings and goings from the barn. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't asking random questions. She knew something. "What makes you think my property specifically?" Sarah's gaze moved past him toward the barn, and James saw knowledge in her face that went beyond standard wildlife biology. "Mr. Crawford, I need to be honest with you about why I'm really here." She pulled a thick folder from her pack, and its contents organized with the precision of someone who'd spent years compiling evidence. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am a wildlife biologist. But I'm also the great-great-granddaughter of Robert Mitchell. I believe my ancestor was murdered on this property in 1876, and I believe your family has been protecting the evidence ever since." The words hung in the cold November air, like an accusation. James stared at the folder, at the old documents and photographs visible through its open edge, and felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he'd believed about his family's history, their honest pioneer heritage, their legitimate claim to this land, was about to be challenged by evidence he couldn't immediately dismiss. "That's impossible. This land has been in my family since 1876. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Crawford, claimed it legally from the territorial government." Sarah's expression carried the weight of someone who'd heard this response before and had prepared for it. "Samuel Crawford was one of 3 men who killed my ancestor and stole his discovery. I have Robert's journal letters he wrote to his wife, descriptions of his partnership with Samuel Thomas Reed and William Hayes. They found gold, Mr. Crawford, a significant deposit. Robert wanted to share the wealth. They murdered him for it instead." James felt his world tilting off its axis. The folder contained documents that looked authentic. Surveyors' reports, territorial land claims, personal correspondence in flowing 19th century script. There were photographs of Robert Mitchell, a serious-looking man with intelligent eyes, standing next to equipment that marked him as a prospector. And there were genealogical charts tracing Sarah's lineage back through 5 generations to the man who'd supposedly died on this land. "You've been researching this for how long?" 3 years intensively. "But my family has known pieces of the story for generations." Sarah's voice carried the steady calm of someone presenting facts rather than making accusations. "We had Robert's journal letters. He sent home descriptions of his partnership with the 3 men. What we didn't have was proof of what happened to him, until I started tracking the descendants of the men who killed him." Before James could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the valley. A convoy of trucks was making its way up his long driveway, kicking up dust clouds that announced their arrival from miles away. James counted at least 4 vehicles, including what looked like an official government truck, and felt a cold dread settling into his stomach. The lead vehicle stopped near the house, and a man emerged who immediately commanded attention. He was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with graying hair and sharp features that reminded James unsettlingly of old photographs he'd seen of frontier-era settlers. He wore hunting clothes and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ms. Mitchell," the man said, his voice carrying barely concealed hostility. "I should have known you'd surface here eventually." He turned to James with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Victor Hayes, Regional Hunting Coordinator. I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Crawford, but we have reports of dangerous predator activity in this area." Sarah stepped protectively closer to James. "Mr. Hayes has no official authority here. He's a private hunting guide with a personal agenda." I have state permits to remove problem wolves, Victor replied, pulling out official-looking documents. And Ms. Mitchell here has been harassing the families of honest settlers for months with her conspiracy theories about events that happened 150 years ago. The tension between Sarah and Victor was palpable, suggesting a history of conflict that extended beyond this moment. James realized he was caught between two people who knew far more about his property and its secrets than he did, and both of them seemed to be circling something they believed existed beneath his land. What exactly are you looking for, Mr. Hayes? Reports suggest you may have a wolf on your property. A large male, possibly part of a breeding pair. These animals pose a significant threat to livestock and potentially to human safety. Victor's gaze moved toward the barn with unsettling familiarity, as if he'd studied the property's layout many times before. With your permission, my team would like to conduct a thorough search. And if I refuse permission, Victor's smile became predatory. Then I'll return with a court order and state wildlife officials. This isn't really a request, Mr. Crawford. It's a courtesy notification. Sarah grabbed James's arm, her grip urgent. You don't have to allow this. Gray wolves are federally protected. Mr. Hayes can't just hunt them on private property without specific evidence of livestock predation. Actually, I can, Victor said, producing another document. Emergency Removal Authority for Dangerous Predators. One phone call to the right office, and this becomes an official operation. James found himself trapped between competing authorities, neither of whom he fully trusted. Sarah's story about his family's criminal past was shocking but unproven. Victor's authority seemed legitimate, but felt wrong in ways James couldn't articulate. Most critically, both of them seemed to know more about his property than they were revealing, and he could see in their faces that Ash was somehow central to whatever conflict they'd been waging. I'll need to see all your documentation before I allow any search, James said, buying time while his mind raced through options. And I want to understand exactly what you're looking for and why you believe it's on my land. Victor exchanged glances with his team members, and James noticed they were all armed, all wearing tactical gear that suggested this was more than a routine wildlife survey. One of them carried equipment that looked sophisticated: thermal imaging, acoustic sensors, tracking devices that belonged in a military operation rather than a standard predator removal. We have acoustic evidence of wolf activity centered on your property, Victor said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Specifically howling patterns that suggest a large male in distress. The recordings indicate an animal significantly larger than standard gray wolf parameters. The words sent ice through James's veins. They knew about Ash's sounds, had been monitoring his property long enough to identify specific patterns. This wasn't a random search. It was a targeted operation based on surveillance that had clearly been ongoing for some time. Sarah's face had gone pale. Victor, you can't seriously be planning to hunt a wolf based on acoustic evidence alone. There are legal protections. Legal protections that don't apply to dangerous hybrids, Victor interrupted. And based on our evidence, this isn't a normal wolf. Size estimates suggest an animal significantly larger than standard parameters, possibly indicating hybridization with dogs or other canids. James realized with growing horror that Victor wasn't just hunting any wolf. He was hunting Ash specifically. The surveillance, the timing, the specific knowledge of a size and behavior patterns, all of it pointed to a coordinated effort targeting the wolf James had been caring for. How long have you been watching my property? Victor's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Standard monitoring protocols for reported predator activity. Nothing invasive, just acoustic surveillance and track documentation. You've been stalking the families of Crawford Reed and Hayes' descendants for months, Sarah said flatly. This isn't about wolf management. This is about covering up your family's crimes. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Victor's careful composure cracked slightly, revealing something darker underneath. My family's crimes, Ms. Mitchell, your ancestor, was a claim jumper and a thief. If he met a bad end, it was justice for trying to steal from honest settlers. Robert Mitchell discovered that gold vein legally and offered to share it. Your great-great-grandfather and his partners murdered him for it. James watched the confrontation escalate, understanding finally that his property was the center of a conflict that had been brewing for generations. Sarah represented one side of a historical injustice. Victor represented the other. And somehow Ash had become the focal point of their dispute. I want everyone off my property, James said firmly. Right now, Sarah, Victor, all of you. I need time to process this information and verify everyone's claims before I allow any searches or surveys. Victor's expression hardened. Mr. Crawford, I'm trying to handle this cooperatively. Don't make me involve state authorities. Involve whoever you want. This is my land, and I'm asking you to leave. As the vehicles departed, Sarah lingered, her face tight with urgency. James, there's something else you need to know. The wolf you've been caring for Ash, he's not just any wolf. He's a descendant of wolves that lived with Robert Mitchell. His lineage has been protected by sympathetic members of your family for nearly 150 years. James stared at her, his mind reeling. How do you know about Ash? Because I've been tracking his family line my entire adult life, and because Victor Hayes has been hunting them just as long. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him photographs of documents, genealogical charts tracing not human lineages, but wolf bloodlines extending back through generations, to a notation that read, Luna Gray, female, pregnant, at time of massacre, March 1876. Your grandfather David contacted me 2 years before he died. He wanted to ensure that if something happened to him, someone would know about Ash, would understand what he represented. We were planning to move Ash to a protected sanctuary, but David died before we could arrange it. And you didn't think to tell me this when he died. You just buried your wife and daughter. David made me promise to wait until you were ready. Sarah's voice carried genuine regret. But Victor doesn't care about your grief or your readiness. He's been waiting for David to die so he could finally finish what his family started. James felt the weight of revelation pressing down on him. His property wasn't just land inherited through generations. It was a crime scene, a sanctuary, and a battlefield where the past refused to stay buried. Ash wasn't just a wolf. He was living evidence of murder, theft, and a family secret that had been protected for a century and a half. And now Victor Hayes was coming to destroy that evidence, just as his ancestor had destroyed Robert Mitchell. James made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He'd spent 3 years running from engagement with life, avoiding connection, existing in a hollow routine that kept him safe from the pain of caring. But Ash had changed that. The wolf had given him purpose, had filled a void he didn't know could be filled, and James would not stand by while Victor Hayes destroyed the one thing that had made him feel alive again. Show me everything, he said to Sarah. All of it. Robert's journal, your research, the evidence about my family. If I'm going to protect Ash, I need to understand what I'm protecting him from. Sarah's expression shifted to relief mixed with determination. There's more. The chamber where you found Ash, that's just one section of an extensive tunnel system. Robert built it with help from local tribal communities who knew the land. It extends much further than you've explored. James thought about the tunnels he'd walked, the chambers he'd discovered, and realized he'd barely scratched the surface of what lay beneath his property. How much further? Far enough to hide bodies, far enough to conceal evidence of crimes that powerful men wanted buried. Sarah's voice dropped to something quieter, heavier. And far enough to protect a species that shouldn't have survived, but did, because your family chose atonement over silence. James looked toward the barn, thinking of Ash waiting below, trusting in his daily visits, depending on him for food and water, and the simple comfort of presence. The wolf had no idea that his existence was about to trigger a confrontation generations in the making. But James knew, and for the first time since Rachel and Lily died, he felt the fierce pull of protective instinct, the bone-deep need to stand between something precious and the forces that wanted to destroy it. We go down tonight, he said. Show me everything Robert Mitchell built. Show me what my family has been hiding. And show me how to keep Ash alive when Victor Hayes comes back. Because Victor would come back. James knew it with the certainty of someone who'd seen that calculating look in the other man's eyes. The 48-hour grace period was just theater, a legal formality, before Victor unleashed whatever operation he'd been planning. And when he did, James needed to be ready with more than good intentions and a crowbar. He needed to understand the battlefield. He needed to know what he was fighting for. And most importantly, he needed to prove that the bond between him and Ash was strong enough to overcome a century and a half of buried crimes and generational hatred. The sun was setting over the Montana plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded James painfully of the last sunset he'd watched with Lily before she died. But this time he wasn't watching alone. Sarah stood beside him, and somewhere in the tunnels below, Ash waited, golden eyes fixed on the darkness, trusting that James would return. That trust, fragile and fierce, was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth whatever price Victor Hayes's return would demand. James Crawford had been hollowed out by loss, carved empty, by grief reduced to simple existence, without purpose or passion. But standing on the threshold of his barn as darkness fell, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The absolute certainty that what came next mattered, that the choices he made would echo beyond his own survival, that love and loyalty could transcend the boundaries between species and create something worth defending against the gathered forces of history's darkest moments. Ash had saved him by needing him. Now James would return the favor no matter what horrors the tunnels revealed or what enemies gathered beyond his property line. The wolf was worth it. The truth was worth it. And for the first time since he'd identified his family's bodies in the morgue, James Crawford believed his life was worth it too. Sarah descended into the tunnels with the confidence of someone who'd studied their architecture for years, her headlamp cutting precise paths through darkness that had swallowed too many secrets. James followed, acutely aware that he was walking through spaces his grandfather had known intimately, while keeping their existence hidden from everyone who should have mattered. The main chamber where he'd found Ash opened into 3 separate passages, each one marked with carved symbols James had initially dismissed as random scratches in the stone. They're directional markers, Sarah explained, running her fingers over the deepest cuts. Robert learned them from the crow guides who helped him prospect this area. This one means water source. This one indicates living quarters. And this one, she touched a symbol that looked like interlocking circles, means sacred ground or burial site. The passage marked with interlocking circles descended sharply, the temperature dropping as they moved deeper into the hillside. James could hear water moving somewhere in the darkness, an underground stream that explained how the tunnel system had remained dry despite Montana's harsh winters. The engineering was remarkable, the kind of work that required not just skill, but intimate knowledge of the land's hidden geography. Sarah stopped at a junction where the tunnel split into 2 directions, both passages identical in construction, but marked with different symbols. Robert's journal mentions a chamber he called the witness room. He wrote that if anything happened to him, the truth would be preserved there. I've never been able to find it, but your grandfather told me it existed somewhere in this section. They chose the left passage, moving carefully over stones that had been placed with deliberate precision. The air smelled of earth and something else, something organic that made James's skin prickle with instinctive wariness. When Sarah's headlamp finally illuminated the chamber ahead, James understood why his body had been preparing him for horror. The skeletons were arranged in a circle, 8 wolves surrounding a single human form at the center. Time had scattered some of the smaller bones, but the positioning was clear enough to tell a story. The wolves had died defending the man. They'd protected their bodies, forming a barrier that hadn't been enough to stop bullets or the brutality of men who killed for gold. Sarah knelt beside the human remains, her hands shaking as she pulled out a digital camera. The skull showed a clear entry wound at the base, the kind of damage that came from being shot execution style from behind. Surrounding bones bore marks consistent with being moved or disturbed, though whoever had buried Robert here had at least afforded him the dignity of keeping him with the animals who'd died trying to save him. This is him. Sarah's voice cracked, and James saw tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. This is Robert Mitchell, murdered by men who pretended to be his partners, buried in secret by men who stole everything he'd worked for. James examined the wolf skeletons, noting the size and structure that marked them as larger than modern gray wolves. Near one of the larger females, he found smaller bones that had clearly been moved and rearranged multiple times over the years. Someone had been tending this grave, had been maintaining it as a shrine or a reminder, and James knew with cold certainty who that someone had been. David had known. His grandfather had known about this chamber, about these bodies, about the murder that had founded the Crawford family's claim to prosperity. And he'd chosen to protect the evidence rather than destroy it, to maintain the secret rather than expose it, walking a line between complicity and atonement that must have cost him everything he believed about honor and legacy. Sarah photographed the scene, methodically documenting angles and details with professional precision that couldn't quite hide her emotional devastation. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels and pulled a worn leather journal from her pack. Robert wrote his final entries knowing he was going to die. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible in the beam of her headlamp. He describes his partnership with Samuel Crawford, Thomas Reed, and William Hayes. They found gold in the spring of 1875, a vein rich enough to make all of them wealthy. Robert wanted to file proper claims, divide the profits equally, but the others had different plans. She read aloud, her voice steady despite the tears, March 19, 1876. Samuel came to me tonight with whiskey and apologies. He wanted to discuss final preparations for our trip to Helena to file the claims. But I saw the lie in his eyes, saw the way Thomas and William watched from the shadows. The wolves know. Luna won't let me go anywhere without at least 3 of her pack surrounding me. She senses the betrayal coming before I'm ready to accept it. James listened as Sarah continued reading each entry, detailing Robert's growing awareness that his partners intended to kill him. The journal described how the wolf pack led by a female Robert called Luna had adopted him during the harsh winter of 1875, how he'd shared his food and shelter with them, how their intelligence and loyalty had created a bond he'd never expected to forge. March 20th. I've hidden this journal and my copy of the claim documents in the chamber Luna showed me last month. The tunnels extend for miles, built by people who understood this land long before white men arrived. If I die, perhaps someone will find this someday and understand what happened here. The wolves are restless tonight. Luna is pregnant, close to whelping. I pray she survives what's coming. The final entry was dated March 21st, 1876, written in a hand that trembled with fear or anger or both. They will kill me tomorrow. I'm certain of it now. Samuel's pretense has dropped entirely. When I suggested we wait another week before traveling to Helena, he became furious, insisted we leave at dawn. But I've seen the rifles they've been cleaning, seen the way they measure distances as if calculating fields of fire. The gold will make them rich, but killing me will ensure they never have to share it. I've made my peace with God. My only regret is that my wife will never know the truth, and that Luna's cubs will be born into a world that just became more dangerous for them. Sarah closed the journal carefully, her hands gentle with the artifact that had survived 148 years to bear witness. Robert was right about everything except one thing. Luna survived. She was pregnant when they killed Robert and massacred her pack. She gave birth somewhere in these tunnels and raised her cubs alone. Every wolf in Ash's lineage descended from her, from the last surviving member of the pack that died trying to protect a man who'd shown them kindness. James thought about Ash, about the golden eyes that carried intelligence beyond normal wolf parameters, about the trust and loyalty that had defined their relationship from the first moment. That capacity for bonding with humans hadn't emerged randomly. It had been bred into the line through generations of wolves who'd learned that some humans were worth protecting, worth trusting, worth dying for. We need to document everything, Sarah said, pulling out additional equipment from her pack. The remains, the journal, the artifacts Robert left. This is evidence of murder, theft, and a cover-up that's lasted almost a century and a half. With this, we can prove what really happened, can expose the lies that built the Crawford, Reed, and Hayes fortunes. James helped her photograph the chamber from every angle, catalog the bones, measure, and mark positions. The work was meticulous and gruesome, turning history into data, transforming tragedy into evidence that might finally force the truth into daylight. But as they worked, James became aware of something that made his hands still over the camera, fresh scuff marks on the tunnel floor near the entrance to the chamber. Boot prints in the dust, recent enough that the edges hadn't settled or blurred. Someone else had been here, someone who'd found this place and left without disturbing anything. Sarah saw where he was looking and went pale. Victor, he's been surveilling the property, but I thought it was just acoustic monitoring. If he's been inside the tunnels, if he knows about this chamber, then he knows exactly what he's trying to destroy. James finished. This isn't just about hunting Ash. It's about eliminating the last evidence that could expose what his family did. They moved through the remaining chambers quickly, Sarah's knowledge of Robert's journal guiding them through passages James would never have found on his own. They discovered living quarters that had been maintained for decades, tools from the 1870s, alongside items from the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s. Each generation of Crawfords had added to the space, had contributed to protecting the secret, had chosen to maintain the sanctuary rather than expose the crime. In a chamber that looked like it had served as David's primary workspace, they found evidence that made James's chest tighten with a mixture of grief and pride. His grandfather had documented everything photographs of Ash as a pup medical records, spanning years behavioral observations that read like scientific studies of cognitive development in wolves. David hadn't just been protecting Ash. He'd been studying him, understanding him, building a case for why this bloodline deserved protection beyond simple atonement for historical crimes. The final page of David's notes was addressed directly to James. "You'll think I should have told you about all of this while I was alive. You're right. But you were drowning in grief, and I couldn't add the weight of this secret to what you were already carrying. Ash needs you more than he needed me. He needs someone young enough to protect him for the next 20 years, someone strong enough to stand against the Hayes family when they finally make their move. I know you'll do what's right. You always have, even when doing right cost you everything. Love, Grandpa David." James sat in the chamber where his grandfather had spent countless hours surrounded by evidence of a life's work devoted to protecting a wolf whose existence represented both crime and redemption. David had known about Victor Hayes, had known the threat was coming, had prepared as best he could while fighting the heart disease that would eventually kill him. And he'd gambled that James, broken and hollowed out by his own losses, would find purpose in protecting what David could no longer defend. "We need to get back to the surface," Sarah said, checking her watch. "It's been almost 4 hours. Victor said he'd return in 48 hours, but that was 12 hours ago. We've got less than a day and a half before he shows up with whatever force he's been assembling." They climbed back through the tunnels, the weight of discovery pressing down harder than the earth above their heads. Ash was waiting in the main chamber, and when James emerged, the wolf approached with clear concern, pressing his massive head against James's chest as if checking for injury or distress. "I'm okay, boy." James ran his hands through Ash's fur, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of him. "But we've got problems coming. Big ones." Ash seemed to understand the gravity in his tone. The wolf's ears swiveled toward the barn floor above, tracking sounds James couldn't hear, assessing threats with senses that had been honed through generations of survival. Sarah was already on her phone, speaking quietly but urgently to someone James assumed was law enforcement. When she disconnected, her face was grim. "I reached FBI agent Tom Morrison. He's been investigating Victor's activities for months, but he needs more evidence before he can move. The trafficking network is extensive, and if they arrest Victor without sufficient proof, the rest of the operation goes underground." "How much evidence does he need, video or audio of Victor attempting to illegally capture or kill protected wildlife?" "Proof that he's operating outside the bounds of his permits. Morrison can use that to get warrants for everything else, can bring down the entire network. But he needs it documented, needs it irrefutable." James thought about the sophisticated equipment Victor's team had carried, the tactical gear and weapons that belonged to military operations rather than wildlife management. They're planning an assault, not a survey. When they come back, they won't be requesting permission. They'll be taking what they want by force. Then we need to be ready to document it. Sarah pulled a small video camera from her truck, professional grade, with night vision capabilities. "We set up cameras covering the barn entrances, the tunnel access points, anywhere Victor might try to breach. When he makes his move, we capture everything and hand it to Morrison." They spent the rest of the night installing hidden cameras, positioning them to capture approaches from every direction. James tested each angle, making sure they would record faces clearly enough for identification actions, definitively enough for prosecution. The work kept his hands busy while his mind raced through contingencies, through scenarios where Victor brought overwhelming force or legal authority that James couldn't resist. Dawn came cold and clear, the sun struggling above the horizon to illuminate a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful. James stood on his porch with coffee he wouldn't drink, watching the road for vehicles that didn't appear, feeling the pressure of waiting like a physical weight on his shoulders. Sarah emerged from the barn where she'd been sleeping in the loft, keeping watch over the cameras and Ash. "Local news is running a story about dangerous wolf sightings. Someone leaked reports about livestock predation, crop damage, threats to public safety. It's all manufactured, all designed to build public support for Victor's operation." James pulled up the article on his phone, reading through claims that wolves had killed 3 calves on neighboring properties, that tracks indicated a pack of at least 6 animals, that children playing outside were at risk. Every word was a lie, but presented with enough official-sounding sources to seem credible. "They're preparing the battlefield, making sure that when Victor moves, he looks like he's protecting the community instead of covering up crimes." The phone in his pocket vibrated with A text from an unknown number, 36 hours, Mr. Crawford. Use them wisely. James showed the message to Sarah, watching her face tighten with recognition. That's Victor's number. He's letting you know the countdown is active, that whatever you do in the next day and a half won't be enough to stop what's coming. Then we make it enough. James pocketed the phone and headed for the barn. Morrison needs evidence. We'll give him evidence. But we do it on our terms, not Victor's. They spent the day fortifying their position, installing additional cameras, creating backup power systems for the recording equipment, documenting everything they discovered in the tunnels. Sarah uploaded copies of Robert's journal to secure servers, sent photographs of the gravesite to Morrison's office, built a digital trail that would survive even if the physical evidence was destroyed. James worked alongside her, his hands remembering the skills Rachel had taught him about preparing for emergencies, about building redundancies into critical systems. They installed motion sensors around the property perimeter, rigged alarms that would alert them to approaching vehicles, created escape routes through the tunnel system in case retreat became necessary. Ash watched their preparations with clear understanding, his golden eyes tracking their movements, with an awareness that went beyond simple curiosity. When James took a break to bring him fresh food and water, the wolf refused to eat, instead positioning himself near the tunnel entrance like a guard assuming his post. You know something's coming, don't you? James knelt beside Ash, meeting those remarkable eyes. You can sense the danger the same way Luna sensed it 148 years ago. Ash leaned into James's touch, accepting the comfort while maintaining his vigilant posture. The bond between them had deepened over the past weeks into something that transcended simple human-animal relationship. James would die protecting Ash, and he knew with absolute certainty that Ash would die protecting him. That mutual willingness to sacrifice was both terrifying and profoundly meaningful, the kind of connection that proved love could exist without language, without shared species, without anything except the choice to value another life above your own. Sarah called from the barn floor above, her voice sharp with urgency. James, you need to see this. He climbed the ladder to find her laptop displaying satellite imagery of his property overlaid with heat signatures and movement patterns. Morrison sent this. Victor's team has been conducting reconnaissance for the past 48 hours. They've mapped every structure, identified the tunnel entrance, tracked our movements between the house and barn. The images showed figures moving around the property boundaries at night, using thermal imaging equipment to observe without being seen. James counted at least 8 different heat signatures on various nights, sometimes in pairs, sometimes solo, always maintaining distance while gathering intelligence. They know everything we've done. They know about the cameras, the preparations, probably even that we've been in the tunnels. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone realizing their opponent had been 3 moves ahead the entire time. Victor isn't improvising. This is a planned operation with military precision. Then why give us the 36-hour warning? Why not just move immediately? Because he wants you to run. Sarah met James's eyes with understanding that chilled him. If you flee, if you abandon Ash and disappear, Victor can claim he arrived to find the property abandoned, the dangerous wolf missing, everything handled without confrontation. He gets to eliminate Ash, destroy the evidence, and maintain his public image as a responsible wildlife manager. And if I stay, then he has to go through you to get to Ash, which means witnesses, documentation, potential charges. Victor's gambling that you'll choose self-preservation over protecting a wolf. James thought about the past 3 years, about the hollow existence he'd carved out after losing everything that mattered. He'd spent that time running from engagement, from connection, from anything that might require him to feel or care or risk further pain. Ash had changed, that had pulled him back into the world of the living, had given him something worth protecting, even if protection meant sacrifice. I'm not running. The words came out steady, certain, carrying weight that surprised him with its clarity. Victor Hayes can bring his entire operation, can come with warrants and weapons and whatever authority he's manufactured. I'm not leaving Ash to face them alone. Sarah's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked like fierce pride. Then we stand together. Morrison is driving up from Helena, should be here by tomorrow afternoon. If we can hold out until then, he can intervene with federal authority. 24 hours. James looked toward the tunnel entrance, thinking of Ash waiting below, trusting that James would keep him safe. We can manage 24 hours. But even as he said it, his phone vibrated again with another message. Change of plans. See you at dawn. The timeline had just collapsed from 36 hours to less than 12. Victor was moving faster than expected, pushing the confrontation into darkness, when cameras would be less effective, when confusion could provide cover for actions that couldn't survive daylight scrutiny. Sarah saw the message and immediately called Morrison, her voice clipped and urgent as she explained the accelerated timeline. When she hung up, her face was pale. Morrison can't get here before noon tomorrow. We're on our own until then. Then we document everything and survive until he arrives. James checked the camera systems, verified they were recording to multiple backup drives, tested the motion alarms that would alert them to approaching vehicles. The preparations felt inadequate against the force Victor would bring, but inadequate was all they had. Night fell with the abrupt finality of November in Montana, temperature dropping fast enough to make breath visible in the barn's cold air. James and Sarah took turns on watch, sleeping in shifts that neither of them really managed, adrenaline keeping them wired and alert for sounds that didn't come. Ash remained at his post near the tunnel entrance, his ears swiveling to track every noise from above his body, tense with the awareness that something fundamental had shifted in their safe routine. At 3 in the morning, the motion alarms triggered simultaneously from 3 different directions. James jolted awake to see Sarah already at the laptop pulling up camera feeds that showed vehicles approaching from multiple access points, their headlights off, moving slowly across terrain that should have been impassable in darkness. They're here. Sarah's voice was steady but tight. 7 vehicles, at least 15 people visible so far. They're surrounding the property before announcing their presence. James watched the feeds, counting tactical vests, weapons equipment that included what looked like battering rams and cutting tools. This wasn't a wildlife survey. It was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm resistance before it could organize. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m., Victor's voice carrying false courtesy. Mr. Crawford, this is a courtesy notification that we're executing emergency removal protocols on your property. For your safety, please remain inside your house until the operation is complete. I don't consent to any search or removal. James kept his voice level, knowing the cameras were recording everything. This is private property, and you don't have authorization to be here. We have emergency authority under state wildlife management statutes. Victor's tone shifted to something harder. Your cooperation isn't required, but it would make this easier for everyone involved. The line went dead, and through the barn window, James saw flashlights converging on multiple buildings simultaneously. Victor's team was moving with practiced coordination, executing a plan they'd clearly rehearsed. Sarah was already uploading video to Morrison's secure server, creating a real-time stream that would survive even if they confiscated the physical cameras. They're documenting their own crimes. Every aggressive move, every piece of illegal entry, it's all being recorded. James descended into the tunnels, knowing that Ash was the target and needing to be with him when Victor's team breached the barn. The wolf stood ready, his hackles raised, his golden eyes fixed on the wooden stairs that led up to the barn floor. The sound of boots hitting wood echoed through the chamber as Victor's team entered the barn above. Flashlight beams cut through gaps in the floorboards, searching systematically, and James heard voices calling to each other in the clipped tones of tactical operations. Heat signature confirmed in the northwest corner. The voice was professional, detached, treating Ash like a target rather than a living creature. Preparing to breach the access point. James positioned himself between Ash and the stairs, knowing it was futile but unable to do anything else. The wolf pressed against his side, not hiding behind him, but standing with him, presenting a united front against the invasion. The floorboards above splintered with sudden violence as Victor's team used the battering ram on wood that had held for 148 years. Splinters rained down into the chamber, and then flashlights followed, multiple beams converging on James and Ash. Mr. Crawford, step away from the animal. Victor's voice came from the darkness behind the lights, calm and authoritative. This is a dangerous predator that poses an immediate threat. We need you to move to a safe distance. This wolf has never threatened anyone. James didn't move, didn't step aside. He's injured, recovering, and completely non-aggressive. Whatever authority you claim doesn't extend to killing animals that pose no actual danger. The assessment has been made by qualified wildlife professionals. Victor descended the stairs, 6 armed men, following, their weapons held ready but not quite aimed. For your safety and the safety of this community, the animal must be removed. Ash growled low in warning, the first truly aggressive sound James had heard from him. The wolf's instincts recognized the threat even if James's rational mind was still trying to find a path through this that didn't end in violence. "Stand down or we will tranquilize you both." One of Victor's men raised what looked like a dart gun, the kind used for large animal immobilization. Sarah's voice cut through from the barn floor above, sharp and commanding. "FBI! Everyone freeze and identify yourselves." For one moment, James thought Morrison had arrived impossibly early, that federal authority would stop this before it escalated further. But the hesitation in Sarah's voice told him she was bluffing, buying time they didn't have. Victor's smile was predatory in the flashlight beams. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm afraid you don't have any authority here. This is a state wildlife operation and your interference is illegal." The dart gun fired with a soft pneumatic hiss, and James felt the impact in his shoulder before the tranquilizer began burning through his system. The world tilted, sounds becoming muffled and distant, and through the gathering darkness, he heard Ash's roar of rage, heard gunfire, heard Sarah screaming something that might have been his name. Then there was only darkness, and in that darkness, the terrible knowledge that he'd failed to protect the one thing that had made his life worth living again. James surfaced through layers of chemical fog to the sound of sirens and voices cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. His shoulder throbbed where the dart had entered, and his mouth tasted like copper and ash. The stone floor of the chamber pressed cold against his cheek, and for a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember why he was lying in the tunnels instead of standing, why his vision swam with blurred edges, why his limbs felt disconnected from his intentions. Then memory crashed back with the force of physical impact, the dart gun, the gunfire, Ash roaring in rage and pain. James forced himself upright, his vision clearing enough to see Sarah kneeling beside him, her face pale and streaked with tears. The chamber was blazing with portable lights that Victor's team had set up, harsh LED brilliance that eliminated every shadow and made the scene brutally clear. Ash lay in the far corner, his massive body unnaturally still, blood pooling beneath his left flank, where a bullet had torn through muscle and bone. His golden eyes were half closed, breath coming in shallow gasps that spoke of failing systems and approaching death. No. The word came out as a broken sound James barely recognized as his own voice. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support his weight, the tranquilizer still flooding his system with artificial paralysis. Sarah gripped his arm hard enough to hurt. "FBI is here." Morrison arrived 10 minutes ago with 8 agents. They're arresting Victor's entire team right now. Through the haze, James heard new voices from the barn above, authoritative and sharp with command. "Federal agents' hands where we can see them. This operation is terminated immediately." Victor's response was bitter but controlled. "We have state authority for predator removal. You're interfering with a legitimate wildlife management operation. You have fraudulent documentation and a history of trafficking protected species." FBI agent Tom Morrison's voice cut through Victor's protest with the weight of genuine authority. "Everyone on this property is under arrest pending investigation into violations of federal wildlife protection statutes." James dragged himself across the stone floor toward him. Ash, his body refusing to cooperate, but his will overriding the chemical restraints. The wolf's breathing was labored, each inhale a struggle against the damage the bullet had caused. Blood soaked through James's hands as he pressed them against the wound, applying pressure that felt inadequate against the arterial flow. "Stay with me." James positioned himself where Ash could see him, where those remarkable golden eyes could focus on something beyond the pain. "You survived 148 years of Hayes family hunting. You don't get to die now." Ash's gaze found his face, and James saw recognition there, saw trust that hadn't diminished despite the violence, despite James's failure to prevent this exact outcome. The wolf's breath hitched, stuttered, and for a terrible moment, James thought it had stopped entirely. Then Sarah was beside him with a medical kit, her hands steady, despite the tears still cutting tracks down her face. "I called Dr. Rebecca Moore. She's the best trauma veterinarian within 300 miles. She's coming by helicopter, should be here in 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like an eternity measured against the rhythm of Ash's failing breath. James kept pressure on the wound while Sarah assessed the damage with professional detachment that barely concealed her devastation. The bullet went through his left hip, probably fractured the bone. "He's lost a lot of blood, and I can see tissue damage that's going to require surgery, even if he survives transport." Her voice wavered on that last word, acknowledging the possibility that Ash might not survive the next 20 minutes, let alone the stress of emergency medical intervention. FBI agents descended into the chamber, their tactical gear and weapons identifying them as the response team Morrison had brought. The lead agent took one look at Ash and immediately radioed for additional medical support, his professional calm fracturing slightly at the sight of the massive wolf bleeding out on the chamber floor. Morrison himself appeared moments later, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of fieldwork. His expression shifted through shock and anger as he surveyed the scene, cataloging the evidence of what Victor's team had done. "Mr. Crawford, I'm Agent Morrison. I need you to tell me exactly what happened here." James didn't look away from Ash, couldn't afford to miss a single breath or heartbeat. "They broke into my property with fraudulent authority. They tranquilized me and shot an unarmed, non-aggressive protected animal. Everything else is on the cameras we installed." Morrison pulled out a tablet accessing the video feeds Sarah had been streaming to his secure server. His face went hard as he watched the footage, seeing Victor's team execute their assault, seeing the dart gun fire at James, seeing the deliberate shooting of Ash after the wolf had moved to protect his fallen companion. "This is more than enough for federal charges." Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been building a case for months and just received the final piece of evidence needed to guarantee convictions. "Victor Hayes and his entire operation are finished." The sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the valley, growing louder as Dr. Moore's emergency transport approached the property. James felt a spark of hope ignite against the crushing weight of watching Ash die, felt the possibility that maybe impossibly there was still a chance to save him. Sarah ran up to guide the medical team, and within minutes the chamber filled with controlled chaos as Dr. Moore and two veterinary technicians set up emergency stabilization equipment. Moore was younger than James expected, mid-30s with steady hands and the kind of focused intensity that inspired confidence even in desperate circumstances. She assessed Ash with clinical precision, her examination quick but thorough. "The bullet fragmented when it hit bone. I can see at least 3 major pieces, possibly more. He's going into shock and his blood pressure is dropping faster than I'd like. We need to move him now, if we're going to move him at all." "Will he survive transport?" James forced the question through a throat that felt like it was closing. Moore met his eyes directly, no false comfort or platitudes in her expression. "Honestly, I don't know. The stress of moving him could kill him, but leaving him here definitely will. So we take the risk and hope his will to survive is stronger than the trauma he suffered." They worked with practiced efficiency, establishing an IV line for fluids and pain medication, stabilizing the wound with pressure bandages, preparing a transport stretcher designed for large animals. Ash endured the handling with minimal resistance, his golden eyes tracking James's position, drawing strength or comfort from his presence, even as his body failed. "I'm coming with you." James tried to stand again, his legs finally cooperating enough to support his weight, despite the residual effects of the tranquilizer. Moore nodded without argument. "You're his anchor point. Having you present might be the difference between him fighting to survive or giving up." The helicopter was a military surplus medical transport configured for rapid evacuation of casualties from remote locations. They loaded Ash with agonizing care, every movement calculated to minimize additional trauma. James climbed in beside the stretcher, his hand finding purchase in the thick fur of Ash's neck, maintaining contact that he hoped conveyed everything he couldn't put into words. Morrison appeared at the helicopter door, his expression grim. "I need you to know that what happened here tonight was illegal, immoral, and Victor Hayes will spend the next 20 years in federal prison for it. Your wolf and you both are victims of a criminal conspiracy, and the full weight of federal law enforcement is going to come down on everyone involved. Just make sure they can't hurt him again." James's voice came out rough, abraded by emotion he'd been holding back for hours. "Make sure this ends tonight." "It ends tonight." Morrison stepped back as the rotors increased speed, the helicopter lifting with a stomach-dropping lurch that made Ash whimper despite the pain medication flooding his system. The flight to the University of Montana Veterinary Hospital took 43 minutes, every one of them measured in the rhythm of Ash's labored breathing. Moore monitored his vital signs constantly, adjusting medication dosages, preparing emergency interventions for crises that thankfully didn't materialize during transport. James kept his hand on Ash, kept talking to him in a voice that stayed steady through sheer force of will. You're going to survive this. You're going to heal. And when you do, we're going to make sure Victor Hayes and everyone like him knows that trying to destroy something precious has consequences they can't escape. Ash's ear flicked toward the sound of James's voice, the small movement communicating awareness despite the medication and blood loss and overwhelming trauma. The hospital's emergency bay was prepared when they arrived, a full surgical team waiting with equipment that looked like it belonged in a human trauma center. Moore supervised the transfer with absolute authority, her team moving Ash onto an examination table under lights bright enough to make James squint. We're taking him straight to surgery. Moore's voice cut through the organized chaos with clear command. The bullet fragments need to be removed before they cause additional internal damage, and we need to repair the arterial bleeding that's keeping him unstable. This is going to take hours, Mr. Crawford. I need you to wait outside and let us work. James wanted to argue, wanted to stay where Ash could see him, where his presence might make a difference. But he recognized the futility of interfering with people who had the skills to save the wolf's life, while he only had the will to see it happen. Save him. The words came out as a plea stripped of pride or pretense. Please, Moore's expression softened fractionally. I've been treating animals for 12 years, and I've never seen a wolf with this level of trust in humans. That's worth fighting for. We'll do everything possible. The surgical suite doors closed with finality, leaving James in a waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. He collapsed into a plastic chair, his body finally acknowledging the cumulative toll of the tranquilizer, the adrenaline crash, and the emotional devastation of watching Ash nearly die. Sarah found him there an hour later carrying coffee and news from Morrison. Victor and 11 members of his team are in federal custody. They seized his computers, his financial records, documentation of 52 illegal wildlife transactions over the past 6 years. The evidence is overwhelming. She sat beside him, her own exhaustion evident in the lines around her eyes. Morrison also found proof that Victor knew about the tunnels, about Robert's grave, about everything we discovered. He was planning to destroy it all tonight, eliminate Ash, and then collapse the chamber to bury the evidence of his family's crimes. James wrapped his hands around the coffee cup without drinking, needing the warmth more than the caffeine. We stopped him. But the cost... Ash is still alive. Sarah's voice carried fierce determination. He's fighting. Moore's team is fighting. And when he survives this, because he will survive, we're going to make sure his story reaches people who understand what it means. The surgery stretched into the early morning, the sun rising over the Montana plains, while James paced the waiting room and tried not to imagine all the ways the operation could go wrong. Sarah made calls to colleagues, to news organizations, to federal prosecutors who needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening on the Crawford property. Morrison arrived just after 9 a.m., his face showing the strain of an all-night investigation. We've confirmed that Victor Hayes has been running a wildlife trafficking network across 7 western states. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves, eagles, all sold to private collectors and hunting operations. Your wolf was going to be his biggest score, a genetically unique animal worth hundreds of thousands to the right buyer. The revelation made James's hands clench into fists. He never intended to just kill Ash. He was going to sell him to a private hunting ranch in Texas. The buyer wanted a wolf with unusual intelligence, something that would provide a challenging hunt for wealthy clients. Morrison's disgust was evident in every word. Victor has been planning this specific acquisition for 18 months, waiting for your grandfather to die so he could make his move without interference. The surgical suite doors opened, and Dr. Moore emerged, still wearing her blood-spattered scrubs. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes held cautious optimism that made James's heart stutter in his chest. He's alive. The surgery took 6 hours, but we removed all the bullet fragments we could find. There's one piece too close to a major blood vessel to extract safely, so he'll carry that for the rest of his life. The hip bone is fractured, but should heal with time and rest. James felt his knees weaken with relief so profound it was almost painful. Can I see him? He's in recovery, still under anesthesia. But yes, you can sit with him while he wakes up. Moore's expression turned serious. Mr. Crawford, I need you to understand that we're not out of danger yet. The next 72 hours are critical. If infection sets in, if he develops complications from the anesthesia, if the stress causes his system to shut down, we could still lose him. But there's a chance. There's a chance, and from what I've seen of his will to survive, I'd bet on him beating the odds. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors tracking Ash's vital signs. The wolf lay on his side, his breathing assisted by a ventilator, his massive form looking vulnerable in a way James had never witnessed. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that measured heart rate, blood oxygen fluid levels, creating a technological web designed to catch any crisis before it became fatal. James pulled a chair close to the examination table and placed his hand carefully on Ash's shoulder, avoiding the bandaged areas but maintaining contact. The wolf's fur was matted and dirty, his body showing the toll of trauma and surgery, but his chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity that spoke to basic biological function, continuing despite everything. "I'm here." James kept his voice low, not sure if Ash could hear through the anesthesia, but needing to say the words anyway. "You did it. You survived Victor Hayes just like your ancestors survived his great-great-grandfather. The Hayes family doesn't get to win. Not this time." Sarah joined him in the recovery room, bringing food James couldn't eat and updates he absorbed without really processing. Morrison was coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure Victor faced maximum charges. News organizations were requesting interviews about the discovery of Robert Mitchell's remains. The University of Montana wanted to study Ash's unique cognitive abilities once he recovered. The world kept moving, kept making demands and offering opportunities, but James's entire focus had narrowed to the rhythm of Ash's breathing and the numbers on the monitors that tracked his descent toward waking or dying. Moore checked on them every hour, adjusting medication levels, reviewing vital signs, offering carefully measured optimism. "He's stable. That's as much as we can ask for right now." The first sign of consciousness came 16 hours after surgery, a slight twitch of Ash's ear in response to James's voice. The second came an hour later when his breathing patterns shifted from mechanically assisted to self-directed, his lungs taking over the work the ventilator had been doing. Moore removed the breathing tube with practiced efficiency, watching closely for signs of respiratory distress. Ash coughed a harsh sound that made James wince in sympathy, and then his golden eyes opened, unfocused and confused but unmistakably aware. "Hey, buddy." James leaned forward where Ash could see him without having to move his head. "You're okay. You're safe. Victor can't hurt you anymore." Ash's gaze found his face, and James saw recognition dawn despite the drugs and pain and disorientation. The wolf tried to lift his head, a movement that Moore quickly discouraged with a gentle hand. "Easy. You've got stitches and broken bones that need time to heal. Just rest and let the medicine do its work." But Ash kept his eyes on James, that remarkable golden gaze communicating trust and gratitude and the kind of bond that transcends species boundaries. James felt tears burning tracks down his face, released finally from the iron control he'd maintained through surgery and recovery and the terrible waiting. "You scared me." The admission came out broken, vulnerable, stripped of any pretense. "I can't lose you. Not after Rachel and Lily. Not after you gave me a reason to care about living again." Sarah's hand settled on his shoulder, offering support without words. Moore stepped back, giving them privacy for a reunion that belonged to the two of them alone. Over the next 3 days, Ash's condition improved with stubborn determination that amazed even Moore's experienced team. The infection they'd feared never materialized. The stress they'd worried would overwhelm his system instead seemed to galvanize his recovery. Within 48 hours, he was eating small amounts of food. Within 72, he was attempting to stand despite Moore's strenuous objections. "This wolf has the strongest survival instinct I've ever witnessed." Moore reviewed his chart with something approaching awe. By all conventional metrics, he should still be critical. Instead, he's recovering at a rate that defies normal healing parameters. James watched Ash navigate the recovery room with a pronounced limp that would probably be permanent, the wolf's determination to move and engage overriding the pain medication that should have kept him sedated. "He thinks he needs to protect me. Even now, even injured, he's trying to make sure I'm safe." The bond between them had transformed through crisis into something unbreakable. Ash had taken a bullet protecting James. James had nearly died from tranquilizer dosage meant to overwhelm his system so Victor could access Ash without interference. They'd each chosen the other's survival over their own safety, and that mutual sacrifice created a foundation stronger than blood or shared genetics. Morrison visited on the fourth day, bringing news that Victor Hayes had been formally charged with 18 federal counts, including wildlife trafficking, assault with intent, illegal use of tranquilizing agents, and conspiracy to destroy evidence. His bail had been denied, his assets frozen, his network of collaborators being systematically dismantled by federal investigators. We found communications between Victor and the Texas hunting ranch. They were offering him $300,000 for Ash, with bonuses if the wolf demonstrated the intelligence Victor had been documenting. Your wolf wasn't just valuable to him. He was obsessed with proving that Robert Mitchell's legacy could be monetized and destroyed. James felt cold fury settle into his bones. $300,000. That's what he thought Ash's life was worth. Actually, the buyer was willing to go higher if testing confirmed enhanced cognitive abilities. Morrison's expression was grim. They wanted Ash alive because killing him immediately would have been too merciful. They wanted to study him, exploit him, use him as breeding stock for creating more intelligent prey animals that would provide better hunting experiences. The revelation made James's hands shake with rage he couldn't fully express. How many animals did Victor sell to these people? 52 documented transactions over 6 years. Grizzlies, wolves, mountain lions, eagles. All protected species, all sold to buyers who wanted exotic hunting experiences or private collections. Morrison pulled out his tablet, showing photographs of animals in cages and compounds in situations that made James want to destroy something with his bare hands. Your wolf's case is going to bring down an entire industry of illegal wildlife trafficking. Federal prosecutors are using the evidence we gathered to pursue hundreds of additional charges against Victor's network. Sarah arrived with her own news, her expression carrying excitement that cut through the weight of Morrison's revelations. The University of Montana wants to create a research center focused on human-animal cognitive bonding, with Ash as the founding subject. They're offering funding facilities, full veterinary support for his lifetime, and they want to name it after Robert Mitchell. James looked at Ash, who was resting comfortably, but watching the conversation with clear interest. What does that mean practically? It means Ash gets the best possible care, contributes to scientific understanding of wolf intelligence and cross-species relationships, and becomes a living memorial to the man who first proved that wolves and humans could form bonds based on mutual respect rather than dominance. Sarah's voice carried the weight of years spent researching, documenting, fighting to prove her ancestor's story deserved to be heard. And it means Victor Hayes' attempt to destroy evidence ends up creating something that ensures the truth survives for generations. Moore entered the room, her timing impeccable as always. If we're talking about Ash's long-term care, I need to discuss realistic expectations. The bullet fragment we couldn't remove is going to cause chronic pain. He'll need ongoing medication, regular monitoring, probably physical therapy to maintain mobility. This isn't a return to normal. This is learning to live with permanent damage. James absorbed the information without flinching. Whatever he needs, we'll provide it. The research center, the medical care, all of it. Ash survived because he had reasons to fight. We make sure those reasons stay worth the effort. The conversation shifted to logistics, to timelines, to the practical details of transitioning Ash from emergency patient to permanent research subject. James listened with half his attention, the rest focused on the wolf who transformed his life from hollow existence into purpose-driven engagement with a world he'd stopped caring about. Ash had saved him by needing him. Now James would spend however long it took to ensure Ash had everything necessary not just to survive, but to thrive despite the damage Victor Hayes had inflicted. 2 weeks after the surgery, Moore cleared Ash for transport back to the Crawford property under strict conditions and with ongoing veterinary supervision. The ranch had been transformed in James's absence, the barn converted into a proper research facility with climate control, medical equipment, and observation areas where scientists could study Ash without disrupting his recovery. The tunnel system had been preserved as both historical site and habitat, the chambers where Robert Mitchell had died and where Ash's ancestors had survived, now protected by federal historical preservation orders. Sarah had worked with tribal authorities to ensure the space was treated with appropriate respect, creating educational programs that would bring thousands of visitors to learn about the bonds between humans and wolves, about historical crimes and generational atonement, about the power of choosing protection over destruction. James stood in the main chamber where he'd first found Ash, watching the wolf navigate familiar territory with his new limp, his movements careful but determined. The golden eyes that had first assessed James with cautious evaluation now reflected trust absolute and unshakable. We made it. James knelt beside Ash, running his hands through fur that had been cleaned and groomed during his hospital stay. Victor Hayes is in prison. Your story is going to be told, and you're going to live long enough to see justice for Robert and Luna and everyone who died protecting what you represent. Ash pressed his massive head against James's chest, the gesture of comfort and connection that had become their primary language. The wolf understood, on some level James couldn't fully articulate, that they'd survived something together that most beings never faced. They'd chosen each other when choosing meant sacrifice, had valued each other's lives above their own. Safety had created a bond that proved love could exist without shared language or species or anything except the decision to protect what was precious. Sarah descended into the chamber carrying a small wooden box, her expression solemn. Morrison found this in Victor's confiscated belongings. He thought you should have it. Inside the box was a collar, old leather worn smooth by time, with a brass plate engraved with a single word, Luna. This was hers. Sarah's voice caught with emotion. Victor's great-great-grandfather kept it as a trophy after the massacre. It's been passed down through the Hayes family for 148 years, a reminder of the wolves they killed and the man they murdered. James lifted the collar carefully, feeling the weight of history in the cracked leather. Ash watched with interest, his nose twitching as he caught scents that had survived more than a century. She was pregnant when they killed her pack. She survived alone, gave birth in these tunnels, raised her cubs without the family structure wolves need to thrive. James traced the engraving with his thumb. Every wolf in Ash's lineage descended from her courage and will to survive. And now her great-great-great-grandson is going to ensure her story gets told. Sarah's determination was absolute. The research center, the educational programs, the federal charges against Victor's network, all of it traces back to Luna's decision to trust Robert Mitchell, to protect him, to choose connection over fear. James fastened the collar around Ash's neck, the leather fitting as if it had been made for him. The wolf tolerated the addition with patient acceptance, and when James stepped back, Ash looked every inch the descendant of legends, the living link between past and present, between crime and redemption, between loss and the stubborn insistence that love could transcend death and create futures worth fighting for. Morrison's final report documented how Victor's arrest had triggered investigations across 7 states, leading to the recovery of 43 illegally held animals and the shutdown of 12 trafficking operations. The evidence gathered from the Crawford property had become the foundation of federal prosecutions that would reshape wildlife protection enforcement for decades. But for James, the victory wasn't measured in arrests or recovered animals or legal precedents. It was measured in the rhythm of Ash's breathing and the trust reflected in golden eyes, in the purpose he felt each morning when he woke, knowing that protecting this remarkable wolf was work that mattered beyond his own survival. Rachel and Lily's photographs still covered his refrigerator, their memory still sharp enough to cause pain. But now those images shared space with pictures of Ash, with Sarah's research documents, with drawings from school children who'd visited the educational center and learned that sometimes the greatest courage comes from choosing to care, even when caring means risking everything. The sun set over the Montana plains in shades of orange and purple that James had learned to appreciate again, painting the landscape with beauty he'd stopped seeing during the years of grief. Ash stood beside him on the porch, his limp barely noticeable after months of physical therapy, his golden eyes scanning the horizon with the awareness of a guardian who understood his role. "You gave me my life back." James spoke the words to the gathering darkness, to the wind that carried them across valleys and hills that had witnessed too much violence and not enough healing. Not the life I had before. Something different. Something that matters in ways I'm still learning to understand. Ash leaned against his legs, solid and warm and present, in ways that filled spaces James had thought would stay empty forever. The wolf had taught him that love doesn't require words to be profound, that loyalty can bridge the gap between species, that choosing to protect something precious creates meaning even when meaning seems impossible to find. The research center attracted visitors from around the world, people who came to see the wolf whose existence had exposed a century and a half of buried crimes and whose survival had triggered the dismantling of a national trafficking network. But James knew the real story was simpler and more profound than headlines could capture. It was about a man who'd lost everything finding purpose in protecting a wounded wolf. It was about choosing connection over isolation and engagement over retreat, hope over the hollow safety of emotional shutdown. It was about learning that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer the world is the willingness to care deeply enough that loss becomes possible again. Ash had given James that willingness back. And in return, James had given Ash a future where intelligence and loyalty wouldn't be exploited, but celebrated, where his existence would educate rather than endanger, where the bond they'd forged would stand as evidence that love, real, transformative, life-saving love, could exist between any two beings who chose to value each other above their own safety. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and James thought about Robert Mitchell writing his final journal entry, about Luna giving birth alone in the darkness, about all the Crawfords who'd chosen atonement over exposure, protection over profit. He thought about David Crawford maintaining the secret for decades, preparing for the moment when someone would need to defend Ash against the Hayes family's final attempt at destruction. And he thought about the future stretching ahead, about the research that would come from studying Ash, about the educational impact of his story, about the lives that would be changed by understanding that what seems impossible, wolves and humans forming bonds based on mutual respect and sacrifice, can become reality when both parties choose love over fear. Ash stirred beside him, and James looked down to meet golden eyes that held intelligence, affection, and the unshakable trust that had survived tranquilizer darts and bullets, and the concentrated hatred of men who valued money over life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors to the research center, new data about cognitive development in wolves exposed to prolonged human contact. But tonight was just James and Ash on the porch, where 3 years of grief had slowly transformed into purpose, where isolation had given way to connection, where a man and a wolf had proven that sometimes the bonds that matter most are the ones we never expected to forge. The wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the plains, and Ash lifted his head to test the air, his instincts reading messages James would never fully understand. But understanding wasn't required for love, wasn't necessary for loyalty, wasn't needed for the kind of connection that transcends language and species, and every rational explanation for why such bonds shouldn't exist. They existed anyway. And in existing, they proved that even in a world capable of profound cruelty and generational hatred, there remains space for mercy, for redemption, for the stubborn insistence that choosing to protect the vulnerable could create meaning powerful enough to heal wounds a century and a half old. James Crawford had fallen through the floor of his barn seeking the source of mysterious sounds and found his reason to keep living. Ash had survived bullet wounds and trafficking plots and the concentrated evil of men who saw him as merchandise rather than a living being deserving of protection. Together, they'd built something that would outlast both of them, proof that love, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice for what we value can triumph over forces that seem overwhelming, can expose truths that powerful interests want buried, can create futures where connection matters more than conquest, and where the bonds between different species demonstrate possibilities most people never imagined could exist. The darkness settled completely over the Montana ranch, and James felt peace spreading through his chest like warmth after years of cold. Ash was safe. Victor was imprisoned. Robert Mitchell's story would be told. And a man who'd spent 3 years simply existing had learned how to live again by choosing to protect a wolf who'd needed him as desperately as he'd needed purpose. Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places, James thought as Ash pressed closer against his leg. Sometimes healing requires us to risk being wounded again. And sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the opportunity to love something enough that losing it would destroy us, because that risk of destruction is what proves we're truly alive.